This is a presentation on hierarchy and written rules, two of the features of the bureaucratic model of organization. At the end of this presentation, you will be able to explain the concept of hierarchy as one feature of the structure of the human service organization, explain the concept of written rules as one feature of the structure of the agency. We're dealing here a lot with structure. Explain how an organization can have too much of a hierarchy or too little of it. We're going to look at it both ways. Also explain how an organization can have too much emphasis upon written rules and too little emphasis upon written rules. You will be able to identify both hierarchy and written rules as two of the features of the bureaucratic model of organization. So I want to talk briefly here about what the bureaucratic model is all about. Conceptualized nearly a century ago, the bureaucratic model of organization brought to our attention the importance of various factors about life in the organization that helps us to understand the importance of organizational structure in various forms. There are several factors from this model, only two of which are reviewed in this presentation. By the way, the concept of bureaucracy goes back many centuries. So there are lots of things we could find about bureaucracy much earlier than a century ago, but I give a lot of credit to Max Weber, who approximately a century ago first started studying it and making a lot of observations. And the work of Weber is the foundation for what we will be talking about in this presentation. The first factor I want to talk about is hierarchy. That means you place people in a chart like this. You may see a chart. This is very brief and only a part of a chart. But you'll see at the top of the organization is the executive director. Under that executive director is a service manager. Under the service manager is service staff. On the other side of the chart, you see there's an intake manager, and under intake manager is intake staff. Organizations typically have an organizational chart that depicts lines of authority and lines of responsibility. So what does it tell us? It tells us who answers to whom. It tells us who must go through whom to get to the top, who gets yelled at when things go wrong. These are some of the functions of the organizational chart, which is a key thing for depicting the structure of the hierarchy of the organization. So look at this thing about hierarchy. What if you did not have a chart? Where would you go for help? Where would you go for permission? You would have some confusion, would you not, if you did not have an organizational chart? Does lack of clarity about such things as does this increase your freedom, or does it actually reduce your freedom because people don't know if they're doing what is allowed and become somewhat frozen by this reality? One can argue that situation both ways. Clarity sometimes gives freedom, sometimes clarity restricts freedom. Can there be too many levels in the hierarchy? Look at this particular, and imagine it being even more elaborate than this. You can see here, under each person, except for the top person, under each person, there's only two persons who are your supervisees. And that person has two people who they are supervising and so forth. You're not going to see an organizational chart like this, but I'm trying to simply illustrate the fact that there can be too many levels in the hierarchy. What happens when there are too many levels in the hierarchy? What about the speed of communication? Does it slow it down? What about the time it takes to get approval? I'd say in both cases, more levels in the hierarchy create a problem. What about other things that come to your mind? You might want to think about that as you think about the idea of having too many levels in the hierarchy. Let's look at the other side of the coin. Can there be too few levels? Look at this one. You've got an executive who is supervising just about everybody. Is this a good thing? What if there are too few levels? Do staff have adequate supervision? If my supervisor has 25 people that he or she supervises, that person has very little time available to spend with me. What happens to administrative control? Because the supervisor has very little time to spend with me, the supervisor does not know very much about what I'm doing, therefore does not know if I'm doing the things I'm supposed to be doing. Let's look at this from the standpoint of your organization. Does it have too many levels in the hierarchy, or too few, or about the right amount? Think about this for a moment. Hit the pause button, think about it. Make a note for your answer, because I'll ask you for it a little bit later in some other part of this presentation. Let's look at factor 2, emphasis on written rules. To clarify policies and procedures, organizations have written rules. I'm talking about formal rules, of course. There might be a specific set of intake procedures that are clearly written down for all to see. There might be a personnel rule that says no one can be hired without the approval of the personnel manager. That might be one of the rules in your organization. We are speaking here of formally written rules, not informal rules that seem to be adhered to by staff. So this is factor number 2 of the bureaucratic model that we'll be talking about in this presentation. Can you have too much emphasis on written rules? What if there are rules that are too complicated and encumber the work of staff? What about the enforcement of rules? If you have a lot of rules and they're not enforced, then they're not very effective. And it creates a morale problem also, if there are lots of rules that are just simply ignored. What if there is rigid adherence to rules? Maybe there are clients who are not best served by the letter of the law, so to speak, regarding intake procedures. Organizations often have a little bit of flexibility in the execution of rules, so as to give the individual staff members some discretion in what to do. When the highway patrolman pulls you over for speeding, that person doesn't have to give you a ticket. They make a decision. Can there be too little emphasis on written rules? Where does staff get their guidance? Have you ever heard the statement, there ought to be a rule about that? Well, there was a famous sociologist many years ago, many decades ago, who wrote an essay entitled, There Ought to Be a Rule. This particular sociologist made the case that there are probably more people who need rules to give them freedom to take action than there are people who would prefer fewer rules so they don't have their actions curtailed by the rules. This may sound a little strange. It would seem, I think, initially to think that the more rules there are, the more clear the rules there are, the less freedom you would have. But for some people, that rule gives them freedom to act in a certain way. So give that a little bit of thought, maybe. Can rules potentially inhibit freedom? I just made that comment a moment ago. Can rules potentially give freedom? That was just discussed. I would say that it can do both, and it can do it more for certain people than for others. According to the sociologist I just mentioned, there are probably more people whose freedom is enhanced by clarity of rules than those whose freedom is inhibited by it. What about your organization? Does it have too much emphasis on written rules? Too little emphasis on written rules? About the right amount of emphasis on written rules? Hit the pause button, think about that, decide what is your answer, and then make a note. We will talk about that in a few minutes. Here's a summary so far. The first and second factors in the bureaucratic model of organization are hierarchy and emphasis upon written rules. Each of these two factors has a role to play in the improvement of the functioning of the organization. You can have too much or too little of each of these factors with predictable consequences for the clarity of how the organization is supposed to operate. I hope